The night the mountain opened, Elias Thorne had already been sentenced to die. The sentence had not come from a judge, or a court, or even a battlefield where death at least wore an honest face. It came from a locked shelter door, from a sheriff who would not meet his eyes, from a polished local businessman smiling through blowing snow, and from a town that had decided a broken old warrior and his white shepherd were easier to abandon than believe. By the time Elias reached the tree line above Mercy Pass, the blizzard had erased the road, the lights, and almost the shape of the world itself. Snow moved sideways in sheets so dense it looked like the sky had shattered into white glass. Wind came off Black Anvil Mountain with the sound of something alive and starving, clawing through the pines, driving needles of ice through his beard, into his eyes, down the collar of the old wool coat he had dragged through 3 winters and a life he no longer bothered to measure in years. Beside him, Ghost, the white German shepherd who looked almost unreal in the storm, moved like a spirit pulled out of the snow itself, lean and silent and fierce, his long pale coat whipped flat by the gale, amber eyes never leaving Elias for long. Twice Elias stumbled. The second time he dropped to one knee and stayed there. His gloved hand sank into powder all the way to the frozen ground beneath. His breath came ragged, steam torn apart before it left his mouth. He had been colder in his life. He had been in black water under moonless skies. He had lain motionless in mountain scree with an enemy convoy crawling so close he could smell diesel and cigarettes. But those times he had purpose, brothers, coordinates, mission clocks, voices in his ear telling him where north was. Now there was only white noise and the dog pressing against his shoulder, as if trying to hold him upright by faith alone. Somewhere down below, invisible through the storm, Mercy Pass sat warm behind shuttered windows. Somewhere down there Henry Voss was likely pouring whiskey beside a fire, convinced the old seal had finally gone where inconvenient men were supposed to go. Somewhere behind that locked shelter door Sheriff Wade Mallory was probably telling himself it was for the best, that Elias had chosen this, that a dog with a bad reputation could not be allowed around frightened families, that weather made cowards of everyone. Ghost stopped so suddenly the leash snapped tight. Elias almost fell again. The dog turned his head, ears pricked so hard they looked carved, and began to growl low in his throat. It was not the growl he used for strangers or engines or the men who had come around too often asking about the deed to Elias's cabin. This sound was stranger, sharper, threaded with urgency. Ghost lunged left, off the half-buried game trail, chest plowing snow. Elias cursed under his breath and followed because the one lesson the dog had driven into him over the last 3 years was simple. When Ghost became certain, hesitation cost. The shepherd pushed through waist-deep drifts between boulders crusted with ice and dead spruce limbs bent under the weight of the storm. Then he stopped at a mound that looked no different from the others and began to dig. Snow exploded behind him in frantic sprays, white on white. Elias stood swaying, trying to understand why the dog had chosen this spot to lose his mind. Then the pawing changed. Snow scraping metal makes a different sound than snow scraping stone. Even under the howl of the blizzard, Elias heard it. A dull, buried clang. Ghost barked once, hard and sharp, as if ordering him to move faster. Elias dropped beside him, fingers numb inside his gloves, and clawed at the drift until leather struck iron. A ring handle. Half frozen. Anchored to a square plate hidden beneath decades of snow and forgetting. For a second the storm seemed to pull away from him, the world narrowing to that ring, that metal lid, that impossible thing waiting under a mountain people swore held nothing but old minds and older ghosts. He yanked. Nothing. Ghost jammed his muzzle under Elias's arm and kept digging, exposing edges, hinges, frost-cake seams. Elias planted both boots, wrapped both hands around the ring, and pulled with the last brutal reserve left in shoulders that had breached steel doors in Fallujah and dragged men twice his size through surf and gunfire. The hatch shrieked upward a few inches, frozen loose, and a blast of air rose from below so cold and stale it felt older than the storm itself. Not cave air. Not soil. Conditioned air gone dead and bitter. Human-made. Buried deep. The smell carried rust, machine oil, mildew, and something else beneath it, something faintly electrical, as if sleeping circuits still dreamed in the dark. Ghost froze. Every hair along his spine lifted. He stared into the gap as if he recognized a presence Elias could not yet see. Elias widened the opening enough to reveal a ladder vanishing into blackness, rung after rung disappearing into a shaft lined with concrete. Someone had built this. Someone had hidden it. Somewhere far below, just when Elias told himself the wind was playing tricks, there came a sound so soft he almost missed it, a metallic thump, then another, deep inside the mountain, like an old heart learning how to beat again. Hours earlier he had still believed the worst thing waiting for him in Mercy Pass was another night of silence. But that was before the cabin smoke, before Vasa's eyes, before the locked door, before Ghost dragged him into the teeth of the storm and uncovered something the mountain had spent half a century trying to bury. Elias looked back once toward the vanished town, saw nothing but white ruin, then gripped the ladder and started down after the dog, descending into air that smelled like Cold War steel and unfinished lies, unaware that beneath Black Enville Mountain lay the truth that had destroyed his father, poisoned a town, and waited all these years for a man and a white shepherd with nowhere left to go. The shaft went down nearly 30 feet before Elias's boots found concrete, and by the time he dragged the hatch shut above them the blizzard became a muffled roar, distant and unreal, like war remembered from underwater. Darkness folded around him so completely he could feel it pressing against his face. He clicked on the flashlight he always kept clipped inside his coat, and a white beam cut through floating dust, revealing a narrow corridor with sweating walls. Yellow hazard lines faded to the color of old nicotine, and stenciled letters half flaked away by time. Ghost stood ahead of him, motionless, tail low, head angled as if listening to the bones of the place. The dog's breath smoked in the beam. Elias's own did too. The air down here was cold but not mountain cold. It had a held-in chill, a preserved chill, the kind found in bunkers, magazines, ship compartments sealed after fire. The corridor opened into a square chamber with steel lockers bolted to one wall, and a dead control panel on another. On the floor lay a broken thermos, a scatter of papers fused into lumps by moisture, a boot's sole separated clean from the boot it had once belonged to. Above a sealed inner blast door, a placard hung crooked, auxiliary access, Sentinel Ridge Annex. Elias stared at the words until they felt familiar in the back of his skull without him knowing why. Sentinel Ridge. He had never heard the name spoken in town, not once, yet something about it seemed to belong to old rumors whispered around his childhood like smoke that adults thought children could not smell. Ghost paced the perimeter, sniffing, then returned and leaned lightly against Elias's leg, grounding him. That was what the dog did better than any human ever had. Ghost never asked what memory had just broken the surface. He simply recognized the shift before Elias did, the tightening of lungs, the tunnel narrowing, the reflexive scan for exits. 3 years earlier, when Elias first saw the white shepherd in a county kennel 200 miles south of Mercy Pass, the dog had been a wreck of scar tissue, ribs, silence, and rage. The deputy running the place said the animal had come from a backyard breeder that used him like a stud machine until he bit a drunk handler and got dumped in a pen meant for violent dogs. "He doesn't trust men," the deputy had said. "And he sure as hell doesn't trust uniforms." Elias had almost laughed at that, because by then he didn't trust men either, and he had spent a career being the uniform others feared. Ghost stood in the far corner of the kennel, white coat yellowed, one ear torn at the edge, eyes flat and watchful in a face too intelligent for captivity. Every time someone approached, he did not bark. He simply withdrew into a stillness more unsettling than aggression, as if he had already judged the species and found it wanting. Elias crouched outside the fence and said nothing. The dog looked at him for a long time, then walked forward and pressed his nose to the chain link. No growl. No fear. Just recognition. Something broken noticing something else that was trying not to bleed where the world could see. Elias signed the papers the same day. The deputy asked what he would call him. Elias looked at the white coat, at the way the dog moved like snowfall across stone, and answered without thinking. Ghost. From that day on the shepherd became the only living creature who knew how bad the nights could get. Ghost learned the difference between dreams that merely shook Elias awake and the ones that dropped him straight back into the red surf of memory. He learned how to put his weight across Elias's chest until the old soldier remembered how to breathe. He learned the smell of whiskey and the moment Elias would reach for it, and sometimes the dog would simply sit in front of the cabinet and refuse to move until the urge passed or the man did. He learned, too, the road back to Mercy Pass after 40 years away, the road Elias swore he'd never take. He had returned because retirement had turned out to be a fancy word for listening to the dead in smaller rooms. 26 years in the teams had left him with titanium in his shoulder, gravel in his spine, hearing loss in one ear, and a silence inside him that no metal ever reached. What finished him was not combat. It was Caleb. His son had grown up in the shadow of a father who came home hard, distant, trained to love in procedures rather than words. Caleb joined the Marines at 19. Anna, Elias's wife, looked at him the day the boys shipped out and said the thing Elias feared most because it was true. He enlisted trying to be seen by you. Caleb died outside Sanjan before his 22nd birthday. Elias got a folded flag and a coffin too light for what it carried. Anna stayed 6 more months, then left behind a note on the kitchen table that said she could not spend the rest of her life living with a man who had buried himself and mistaken it for endurance. Mercy Pass was the only place left that still had his name on a piece of land. A decaying cabin at the edge of Black Anvil Mountain, inherited from the father Elias barely remembered and had spent most of his life resenting. Daniel Thorne disappeared in the winter of 1968, when Elias was 6. Official story said he had walked out during a storm and never came back. Unofficial story, repeated with pity and contempt in equal measure, said he'd abandoned his wife and son after drinking too much and knowing too much. Elias grew up on that version of the man until it calcified. He came back to the cabin not because he loved the place, but because grief makes scavengers of us all, and sometimes a man goes digging through ashes simply because he has run out of better ruins. For a while Mercy Pass ignored him. Then Henry Voss came smiling. Voss was the kind of man who wore expensive coats that never seemed to collect snow and spoke softly enough to make refusal feel impolite. He owned half the valley through shell companies and family trusts, and the other half owed him loans, jobs, or favors. He told Elias he was assembling parcels for a clean energy survey, maybe rare earth, maybe storage, maybe infrastructure that would bring prosperity back to the county. He offered cash for the cabin and the ridge above it. Enough cash to make most lonely men sign before the coffee cooled. Elias said no. After that, the odd things began. Trucks on the service road after midnight. Vibrations under the floorboards that felt too regular to be natural. Men walking property lines pretending not to look armed. Ghost growling at the dark corner of the hill as though something underneath it offended him. Mara Mallory, the sheriff's daughter and the town's paramedic, came by once under the excuse of checking on an old veteran in winter isolation. In the kitchen, while Ghost sat pressed against her knee as if measuring her honesty, she told Elias in a low voice that Voss's company had brought in equipment under state permits that did not match what locals were being told. "If you've seen drilling rigs on the ridge," she said, "you're not imagining it." Elias went to the town meeting that same night. He should have known better. Storm warnings were already crawling across every phone in the county. The room smelled like wet wool, coffee, and people desperate not to lose what little the mountain had left them. When Elias stood and asked why Henry Voss was drilling near the watershed above Mercy Pass, the room shifted. When he asked why unmarked trucks were running at night over old federal easements, it froze. Voss stood with perfect calm and expressed concern for Elias's well-being, mentioning adjustment issues, mentioning isolation, mentioning that some men had a hard time separating memory from reality after too much war. A few people looked down. A few nodded. Sheriff Wade Mallory asked Elias to sit. Elias did not sit. Voss smiled that clean, bloodless smile and said, "You've been through a lot, Chief. We all respect your service. But accusing people in a panic before a storm helps no one. It ended the way these things always do in small towns ruled by polite power. Not with truth, but with embarrassment redistributed toward the weakest man in the room." By the time Elias got back to his cabin, the front window had been smashed, the deed box rifled, and smoke was rolling out of the rear wall where someone had kicked the old stove pipe loose and let sparks do the rest. He saved Ghost, his rifle, a duffel, and Caleb's folded flag. Everything else the fire took or ruined. Mercy Pass opened the church basement as an emergency shelter when the blizzard turned violent. Elias got there half frozen, Ghost at heel. Sheriff Mallory blocked the entrance. Said the dog would scare children. Said tempers were already high after the meeting. Said Elias smelled like gasoline and smoke and maybe it was better if he found somewhere else for the night. Henry Voss stood 10 feet behind him, dry under the awning, watching. That was how a man who had served his country for nearly 3 decades found himself turned out into a killing storm with only a white shepherd for witness. Now, deep under the mountain, with stale air in his lungs and Ghost's shoulder warm against his knee, Elias looked at the blast door ahead and realized whatever waited beyond it had been hidden before he ever learned to shave, before he learned to shoot, before he learned how easy it was for whole towns to help a lie survive if the truth threatened payrolls and reputations. He stepped toward the door, swept the beam across the lock wheel, and saw scratches in the dust that were far too recent to belong to history. The scratches around the blast wheel were bright where metal had been touched recently, and in the dust below them Elias found a partial boot print, deep at the heel, crisp enough that no decades-old draft could have preserved it by accident. Someone had been in this place. Not 50 years ago. Not even last winter. Recently enough that the mountain had not yet reclaimed the mark. He crouched, ran 2 fingers just above the print without touching it, and felt a pulse of old professional alertness rise through him like heat returning to a numb hand. Go! In another, a chalkboard bore columns of other data that ended mid-sentence, the last chalk mark dragged downward as if the hand holding it had been interrupted by panic or pain. The farther they moved, the stranger the feeling became. Elias had spent enough time inside government steel to recognize its habits. Layouts repeated. Fonts repeated. Even fear had a federal architecture to it. But this place carried something else, something improvised and buried under procedure. Doors where there should not be doors. Reinforced sections deeper in. Vent grills big enough for a person to crawl through. On the wall outside what had once been the communications center, someone had painted over older lettering with thicker military green. The paint had peeled just enough that Elias could read the original underneath: Civil Defense Sublevel Access Restricted. Civil Defense. Auxiliary Annex. If Mercy Pass knew this bunker existed, the town had forgotten on purpose. Inside COM, racks of dead equipment stood like skeletal altars. Reel-to-reel decks. Field radios. Patch panels. An old emergency transceiver mounted beside a switchboard the size of a coffin. On the central table lay a county map protected under cracked plexiglass. Mercy Pass sat in red grease pencil near the bottom edge. Above it, across Black Anvil Mountain and the ridge Elias now owned, another label had been circled and crossed through so many times it looked stabbed: Sentinel Ridge Annex, Omega Storage. Ghost stopped at a bank of filing cabinets and whined once, low in his throat. Elias went to him and noticed that one drawer had been pried open within the last few years, metal bent outward. Inside were personnel rosters warped by damp. Most names meant nothing. Then his beam landed on one entry, and the room seemed to tilt. Thorne, Daniel J., radio technician, contract level 4. Elias did not move for several seconds. The letters stayed where they were, refusing to blur, refusing to become anything other than proof. His father had not vanished into the woods drunk or desperate. He had worked here. Under this mountain. In a place no one had ever admitted existed. The old story cracked open inside Elias so abruptly it left him dizzy. He saw his mother at the sink in their tiny rental outside Missoula, cigarette trembling between fingers she thought he never noticed shaking. He heard relatives say Daniel had run. He remembered boys at school repeating what their fathers said after beers: Thorn blood don't stay put. Men like that leave. He had carried that sentence his whole life like inherited rot, terrified some missing piece in his own chest had come from Daniel. Had Caleb felt it too? Had the distance in Elias been part grief, part training, part fear that abandonment was the truest thing in his blood? Ghost pressed his muzzle into Elias's palm, sensing the shift before the man fully understood it himself. Elias gripped the dog's thick fur and forced air in and out. "He worked here," he said, as if speaking it might make it less impossible. In the bottom of the same drawer he found a thin black notebook sealed in plastic. Inside the front cover was a stamp, property of U.S. Army Signal Corps. Most pages were blank or water-streaked, but halfway through, between columns of frequency notations and maintenance schedules, Daniel Thorne had written in pencil so hard the words had bitten through the paper, "If anything happens, records are not in command." They moved them below Med. Not safe to trust Voss. Elias felt something cold move beneath his ribs. Voss. Henry Voss's family name. Not coincidence. Not anymore. He turned the page and found the next line half erased, maybe by moisture, maybe by trembling fingers. Storm coming fast. They are saying contain and seal. God help us if Mallory agrees. Mallory. Sheriff Wade Mallory's father had been county undersheriff back then. Names running like wires through generations, carrying current no one admitted still lived. A sound echoed through the bunker. Elias snapped the flashlight toward the corridor. Not the building settling. Not pipes. Footsteps, very faint, somewhere below, followed by the click whine of current trying to pass through old systems. Ghost's ears shot forward. His growl was so low Elias felt it more than heard it. Then, one by one, with the weak yellow tremble of exhausted emergency backup, a string of cage lights flickered alive down the corridor outside calm, illuminating dust, open doors, and the long reach of shadows from a power source that should have been dead for decades. Elias killed his flashlight instantly. Darkness swallowed him, but the dim amber emergency lamp stayed on, pulsing like a wounded heartbeat leading deeper into the annex. Somewhere far below, a relay clacked. Then an elevator bell rang once, thin and impossible, and the mountain answered with silence so complete Elias could hear Ghost's breathing change. They moved without speaking because language felt too blunt for a place that seemed to wake as they walked through it. The emergency lights only covered parts of the corridor, leaving long strips of darkness between islands of yellow glow, and in those stretches Elias felt as though the bunker were deciding whether to remember or devour them. He chose deeper instead of back. Maybe that was training. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was the first pull of an answer he had spent his whole life not knowing he needed. The map from Calm suggested medical lay one level down past the birthing section. The elevator was dead, its doors welded open to reveal a shaft clogged by darkness, but a stairwell beside it descended in a square spiral of steel grating. Ghost took the lead, paws placing themselves with uncanny care, white body ghosting in and out of the dim light as if the mountain had called up an old winter spirit to guide the only man stubborn enough to follow. Birthing was a row of narrow rooms, some still holding bunks made with military precision, others ransacked long ago. On one mattress lay a child's red mitten, stiff with age. Elias stared at it longer than he should have. Civil defense, he remembered. Family shelter contingencies. A bunker sold to someone once as protection. Then the questions came harder. If families had been meant to shelter here, why were there blast doors between sectors? Why did so many doors have locks on the outside? In the mess hall, tin trays still stood stacked in cabinets. A pot sat on a stove, blackened contents fossilized. Half a loaf of bread, mummified by 50 winters of dry cold, had fused to a cutting board. Disaster had not ended here cleanly. It had ended in interruption. Ghost stopped at a wall near the base of the stairs and began sniffing a crack where paint had blistered away. Elias joined him and found a maintenance panel slightly ajar. Inside, behind conduit bundles, someone had hidden a small metal key attached to a tag-stamped sub-MED file. Daniel's handwriting covered the back of the tag in tiny cramped script. If you found this, do not trust surface access. They are monitoring main corridors. Use old treatment hall. Jesus! Elias breathed. His father had left breadcrumbs through the dark for a stranger he could not have known would someday be his own son. The treatment hall was harder to find than the map suggested, tucked behind an abandoned infirmary whose white-tiled rooms had yellowed into a sickly ivory. Cabinets hung open. Bandage wrappers littered the floor. An exam table stood under a surgical light like an altar abandoned mid-prayer. In the pharmacy, small brown bottles lay scattered, labels melted by time. The deeper hall behind it looked wrong from the first glance. Concrete walls, yes, but also extra doors. Heavy ones? Too heavy for supply closets. The key fit the first lock. The room beyond held file shelves, overturned carts, and cartons of medical forms. The second door, at the rear, led to a corridor narrower than the others and lined with observation windows, their glass reinforced with mesh. On the far side of one window sat a room no larger than a cell. A drain in the floor. A cot bolted to the wall. A restraint ring. Elias felt his jaw tighten until his teeth hurt. Civil defense, he thought with bitter disbelief. This was no fallout shelter for schoolchildren and canned peaches. This was containment. Detention. Something the public story had wrapped in patriotic language and hidden under a mountain until men like Henry Voss inherited both the land and the silence. Ghost whined at the third room on the left. Elias swept the beam inside and saw a rusted floor-stand, a stool, and a metal locker half open. Inside the locker hung a wool field jacket with a contractor patch on the shoulder, and the name Thorne stitched over the pocket in black thread faded almost gray. Elias touched the sleeve as carefully as if he feared the cloth might feel warm. In the breast pocket he found a wallet sealed in brittle plastic. Inside were two $20 bills, a driver's license from 1967, and a photograph so water-stained it had nearly dissolved. But the faces were still there. A young woman smiling into sun. A small boy in a knit cap on her hip. Elias. His mother. Daniel had carried them here. He had not run. He had brought them underground with him, into a place he feared enough to hide messages in walls. Something inside Elias, locked so long it had become part of his structure, gave way without warning. He turned from the locker and braced both hands against the wall, head bowed, breathing once, twice, then not at all until Ghost pushed against the back of his knees and forced him to bend. Elias sank to the concrete. The dog climbed halfway into his lap despite his size and pressed his forehead beneath the man's chin. No one saw Elias cry when Caleb's coffin was lowered. No one saw him when Anna drove away. No one saw him in the cabin when whiskey failed and dawn came anyway. But in the buried medical corridor of a dead Cold War annex, beside his father's jacket and a photograph that proved love had existed where he had been told only desertion lived, the only witness he had was the white shepherd who had already saved him more times than any medic ever would. The tears came hot and furious, gone almost as quickly as they appeared, swallowed by old training and immediate danger. Because danger was still there. On a desk in the records room behind the cells sat a reel-to-reel tape machine connected to a battery box newer than everything else around it. Someone had installed a portable power source here recently. A tape was already threaded through the spools. Elias hit play. Static burst from the speaker, then a man's voice, young and strained but unmistakably steady under fear. Daniel Thorne, technician, Sentinel Ridge Annex. February 14, 1968. If this recording survives, Command has ordered Level C sealed after coolant breach in the auxiliary reactor. They are calling it quarantine. That is a lie. The leak is contained. This is about the detainee and the manifests. Voss says no one leaves with names. Mallory is helping him. Static crackled. A metallic bang sounded somewhere in the original background of the recording, followed by a woman crying. Daniel continued, voice tighter now. There are civilians down here. 2 county maintenance men. A mother and her son who were brought in off the road before the storm got worse. They saw the lower chamber. They heard the prisoner. Voss says witnesses create escalation risk. God forgive us. The tape warbled. If anyone finds this, records of transfer and burial are hidden. The door behind Elias slammed open. A flashlight beam slashed through the dark corridor. Voices. Male. Close. Ghost spun, hackles high, teeth bared soundlessly. Another beam cut across the observation glass. Tracks end here, someone said. He's inside. Elias snatched the reel from the machine, killed the battery box, and pulled Ghost toward the deeper door just as boots thundered into the records room and a calm voice he recognized even over 50 feet of concrete and history said, "Find Thorne. He is the only thing tonight that matters more than the archive." The first thing Elias noticed was how bad the men were at being quiet. Armed civilians always mistook gear for skill, confidence for discipline, noise for control. They moved through the records room shoving metal carts aside, boots scraping, flashlights jittering over walls and glass, breathing hard from the descent. Whoever Henry Voss had hired knew enough to be dangerous, and not enough to survive a truly patient opponent. Elias took Ghost down the secondary corridor, through a set of swinging doors into what had once been treatment overflow. Gurneys stood tipped against the wall, and a cracked oxygen cylinder lay on the floor like a spent shell. He paused only long enough to orient. 2 exits. One likely looped back toward main medical and the men searching. The other sloped down into a service passage marked biofilter access, authorized personnel only. That was where he went. Behind him, voices split. "Clear those rooms. Check vents. Boss says the dog too." Elias's jaw hardened at that. Ghost moved beside him with a silence that bordered on supernatural, every step measured, every pause timed to Elias's breathing, the dog no longer merely companion but teammate. People who had never worked with a truly bonded animal thought loyalty was sentimental, a warm word fit for plaques and children's books. Real loyalty was colder than that. It was tactical. Instinctive. A live wire between 2 nervous systems that had survived enough pain to stop wasting time on doubt. 3 turns later the service passage narrowed and opened into a maintenance hub crisscrossed by pipes. Elias spotted an old valve wheel, a rack of tools, and a stack of corroded chemical drums chained in place. He listened. One set of footsteps separated from the rest and came alone, quick, confident, flashlight sweeping ahead. Elias crouched behind the drums and touched Ghost's shoulder twice, then pointed left. The shepherd vanished into shadow. The man entered the hub with pistol raised and beam jerking across metal surfaces bright with condensation. He saw nothing. Elias waited until the light passed his hiding spot, then stepped in, hooked the man's wrist, drove him face first into a pipe brace, and caught the weapon before it clattered. The entire exchange took less than 2 seconds. Ghost reappeared soundlessly and planted himself over the man's chest, teeth inches from his throat. No barking, no wasted motion. The flashlight rolled in a slow arc, illuminating a company patch on the intruder's jacket. Voss Mineral and Environmental Recovery. Clean Energy Survey, Elias thought. Sure. He zip-tied the man's wrists with a plastic restraint scavenged from a drawer and leaned close. How many? The man spat blood and tried bravado. Ghost lowered his head half an inch and showed more teeth. The bravado collapsed. 5 down here. 2 at the ridge access. Please get the dog off me. Why now? Elias asked. What are you looking for? The man's eyes flicked toward the tunnel behind Elias, then back. Archive vault. Boss says the old files prove easement ownership and contamination limits were never federal. Says if state inspectors get them, the whole project dies. Elias stared at him. That all? Fear shifted in the man's face, revealing the lie by degrees. And? Ghost gave a low sound that came from somewhere ancient. There's film, the man blurted. Audio. Personnel records. Orders signed by August Voss. Old burial logs. Your dad's name too, maybe. Boss says it's all nonsense if nobody hears it. August Voss. Henry's grandfather. A dead man still reaching up through the family line with filthy hands. Elias took the flashlight and left the mercenary bound under Ghost's watch just long enough to scan the hub. One wall held a schematic under cracked plexiglass. Reactor sector below. Archive vault adjacent to sublevel C. A hand-drawn X near an air-handling chase. Maybe Daniel's, maybe someone else's. Before Elias could study it longer, another sound rose through the passage. Not Boots this time. A voice calling his name, strained and hoarse. Elias! Mara Mallory! Elias moved toward it with pistol up, Ghost gliding ahead, and found her slumped behind a half-collapsed partition where the service tunnel met a stairwell. Snow crusted her hair and shoulders, already melting into the collar of her parka. Blood darkened one sleeve. Her face went from terror to furious relief when she saw him. I followed the rig road, she whispered. Then I saw men go through a hatch. I heard one say Voss wanted you dead before daylight. Elias knelt, checked the wound. Through and through, graze high on the arm. Painful, bloody, survivable. You should have stayed in town. Mara laughed once without humor. Town? Half the power's out. My father's lying to everyone. Voss has deputies blocking the county road and telling people it's down lines. He's moving equipment up the ridge in a blizzard, Elias. Whatever's in this mountain, he's desperate. Ghost nosed her uninjured hand, and she gripped his fur with a kind of gratitude that needed no ceremony. Mara had been 13 when Elias left Mercy Pass for good after his mother's funeral. She remembered him as the hard-eyed local boy who had already learned how to leave. Now she looked at him as though she were seeing the younger man still trapped inside the old one, the one who might once have been worth trusting before war made a bunker out of him too. He bandaged her arm with supplies from a maintenance kit while she talked fast, keeping her voice low. Weeks earlier she had intercepted a patient transfer form at the clinic for a survey contractor suffering radiation burns inconsistent with any public work being done in the county. The man disappeared before she could question him. Then came sealed county memos, weird soil tests, sheriff's office overtime paid through a Voss subsidiary, and old land records missing from the courthouse archive. My dad knows pieces, she said. Not all of it. Enough to be scared. Enough to help Voss convince himself it's about protecting the town from panic. Elias thought of Daniel's tape. Mallory agrees. The disease of compromise passing cleanly from father to son. Behind them, faint but growing, came the voices of the search team redistributing. One of them shouted that Briggs was down. They'd found the bound mercenary. Time collapsed. Elias helped Mara stand and handed her the spare flashlight. There's an archive below reactor level. That's where the answers are. And the exit? She asked. He looked down the tunnel toward the way they had come, now likely crawling with armed men, then at the service schematic again. Gone. A sharp explosion boomed from somewhere above, shuddering dust from the ceiling and knocking old rust flakes loose from the pipes. The lights flickered. A siren gave one choking half-cycle and died. Mara steadied herself against the wall. What was that? Elias didn't answer right away because he knew. Demolition charges. Someone sealing access or forcing new entry. Either way, the upper routes were compromised now. He turned the schematic toward the light. Reactor sector. Archive vault. Intake tunnel. Emergency exhaust shaft. Deeper was no longer curiosity. It was the only direction left. Ghost started down the sloping passage before either human moved, then stopped and looked back once, eyes reflecting pale gold in the failing light, as if he had already chosen the path and expected them to find the courage to follow. Then, from far below, through concrete and 58 years of silence, there came another sound, a woman's voice on some long-dead speaker system, thin with age and static, repeating a message the mountain had held in its throat since 1968. Containment breach on sublevel C. All non-essential personnel report below. Do not open the lower vault. The passage to sublevel C descended through colder air and older fear. Whatever minimal heat or residual current still haunted the annex did not reach this far. Frost filmed the walls in delicate white veins, and their footsteps sent tiny crunches across concrete dusted with crystals. The architecture changed too. Upper levels had carried the bureaucratic geometry of a military facility built to reassure itself. Down here the walls thickened, doors narrowed, and every turn felt defensive. On one side of the corridor, observation slits replaced windows. On the other, Heavy segmented piping ran toward the heart of the mountain, sweating a metallic sheen that smelled faintly bitter even after half a century. Mara's flashlight shook despite her effort to hold it steady. Elias took point again, pistol in one hand, Daniel's key and notebook tucked inside his coat, Ghost ranging a few yards ahead and doubling back whenever the humans lagged. Once, at an intersection choked with fallen ceiling panels, the shepherd stopped so abruptly that Elias nearly collided with him. Ghost sniffed the air, then stepped left, away from the centerline. Elias followed the cue instinctively. A second later he saw a wire. Thin, new, stretched ankle-high between two pipe brackets. Not Cold War. Modern. An alarm or improvised trip device placed by someone currently using the lower annex. He cut it with a maintenance tool and wondered how much of Henry Voss's recovery project had already penetrated these depths. The next chamber answered him. It had once been a kennel block. Four narrow chain-run compartments stood against the far wall, gates rusted open, drain troughs beneath them, faded warning placards overhead, working dog unit, restricted handlers only. Ghost walked in slowly, ears tilted back now, nose drawing long careful pulls of air from the floor, the gates, the troughs, the corners where fur or dust or memory might still cling. In the last run lay a leather collar gone stiff with age, brass plate corroded but readable in the beam. K9 Harker. Elias crouched and picked it up. Beneath the run's bench sat a dented metal bowl and, tucked farther back, a dog tag case. Inside were vaccination records, training notes, and one short entry dated February 14, 1968, Harker refusing to leave Techthorn. Animal distressed by seal order. The words hit harder than Elias expected. Some things did not need explanation. A good dog had stood with Daniel when orders turned rotten and men showed who they were. Maybe that was why Ghost had dragged him here. Not mysticism. Not fate wrapped in pretty language. Just an old pattern repeating in the bones of a species that never forgot who deserved company in the dark. Mara saw the look on his face and said nothing. Smart woman. They moved on. Beyond the kennel block lay the lower treatment ward, and there the secret finally bared its teeth. 3 gurneys sat in a line under blankets that had long ago petrified around the shapes beneath them. Elias did not need to uncover them to know there were bodies there. Radiation markers on the wall had blackened. A Geiger counter clipped beside the doorway, its battery long dead, still carried a grease pencil note from some desperate hand, safe if under 2 minutes. In the station office adjoining the ward, file drawers had been emptied onto the floor, but Ghost went straight past them and began pawing at a section of cinderblock behind a cracked medicine cabinet. Elias shoved the cabinet aside and found mortar newer than the rest. He worked a pry bar into the seam. The block gave after 2 savage pulls, revealing a hollow space just large enough for a metal film canister, 2 audio reels, and a sealed envelope addressed in Daniel Thorne's hand. To my son, if I do not get home. Elias's hand trembled once before he forced it still. Not now. Not yet. He loaded one of the reels into a portable deck they found on a newer equipment cart, left by Voss's men, likely used to verify old media before destroying it. The tape spun. Daniel's voice emerged again, rougher this time, more tired, as if hours had passed and hope had narrowed. Seal is complete. August Voss ordered lower ward and detention kept off manifest. He says Washington will call it necessary if paperwork survives. The prisoner died after second interview. Reactor leak from experimental core was limited, but exposure in service team is real. Mallory says county cannot survive scandal. They mean to blame the storm. They mean to say whoever is left below never existed. A pause. In the background a dog barked once, then whined. Daniel resumed. There is a mother here, Elena Kozlov, picked up on the road with her boy after the truck wreck. They brought them in because the weather closed the pass. She heard Voss talking about disposal. She begged me to get her son out. I tried the upper freight tunnel. Locked. Harker won't leave us. If this gets found, know this, I did not run from my family. I stayed because there were people down here who needed one honest witness. Elias shut his eyes for a moment, that felt like a knife turning. He had built half his life on the wound of a lie. Daniel had not abandoned wife and child. He had chosen not to save himself at the cost of others. The kind of choice Elias had spent decades honoring in strangers while never knowing it lived in his own blood. Mara listened with one hand over her mouth, eyes wet in the flashlight glow. "My father's father helped cover this," she whispered. "God." Elias opened the envelope next. Inside was a single-page letter written in pencil, cramped and urgent. "If you ever hear I left you, don't believe them. I kept your picture in my pocket. I wanted to come home. If I can't be kinder than this place. Do not let anger become the only thing men remember you by." Below the letter lay a crude map of the lower annex with one area circled in red, Omega Vault/Reactor Control/Emergency Exhaust. At the edge Daniel had scrawled another warning. "Voss will come for films. If they reopen chamber, runoff goes to creek. Mercy Pass drinks it." That was the present danger. Not just history, not just names. Henry Voss's drilling and retrieval efforts were threatening to breach whatever old contamination remained sealed beneath Black Anvil Mountain. The town above was sitting beneath a blizzard and a poison legacy at the same time, protected only by lies and decaying concrete. A shot cracked from the corridor outside, loud enough to stun the air out of the room. The portable deck exploded into shards. Mara ducked. Ghost leaped in front of Elias before the man even turned. Another shot punched through the doorframe. "Drop the pistol, Thorne!" a voice called. Deputy Owen Pike. Young, mean, eager. "Mr. Voss says you can walk out if you hand over the media." Elias shoved the canister and letter inside his coat. Ghost was growling now, not loud but terrible, every muscle packed tight as braided cable. Pike laughed from behind cover. "That mutt's not bulletproof." The next second happened too fast for thought. Ghost launched through the half-open doorway just as Pike fired. The shot went wild, sparks skipping off tile. A scream followed, then a crash, then the thick wet sound of a man hitting the floor under sudden violent weight. Elias moved with pure reflex, hit the corridor low, saw Pike pinned beneath the white shepherd, pistol skidding away, forearm torn open where Ghost had chosen flesh over bone with surgical precision. Another mercenary at the far end raised a rifle. Elias fired once. The man dropped behind the corner, cursing. "Move!" Elias shouted. Mara grabbed the spare reel. Ghost released Pike on command but came away limping, blood bright against the white fur of his left shoulder. The sight hit Elias like a hammer. There was no time for grief, only motion. They ran deeper toward Omega Vault while alarms that had been silent for 58 years suddenly began to pulse red through the corridor, and over the annex speaker system Henry Voss's voice came calm and amplified, speaking not to strangers under a mountain but to family business finally turning ugly. "Mr. Thorne, if you force my hand I will flood this level and let history stay buried." Blood looks black before it looks red in bad light, and on Ghost's white fur the darkness spread faster than Elias could stand. They made it through a blast partition and into a valve room dense with pipes before Elias forced them to stop. He barred the door with a steel wrench through the wheel spokes, dropped to his knees, and pulled the shepherd against him. Ghost fought at first, not from panic but from duty, trying to turn back toward the threat, trying to remain the moving shield he had always been. "Easy," Elias whispered, voice rawer than he intended. "Easy, partner. Stay with me." The round had furrowed through the meat of the shoulder, high but clean. Lucky bystanders war teaches and the soul rejects. Elias cut away clotted fur with trauma shears from an ancient med kit and flushed the groove with freezing saline from a cracked emergency locker. Ghost's body trembled once, then held. No snap. No cry. Just those amber eyes locked on Elias with total concentration, as if to reassure the man that pain had not broken the contract between them. Mara knelt beside them, hands steady despite her own wound, holding light where Elias needed it. "He's strong," she said softly. "He'll keep going." Elias almost laughed at the ridiculous understatement. Ghost had crossed the blizzard, found a secret hatch under 20 feet of snow, led them through a Cold War tomb, and taken a bullet in a place where men from town had left them to die. Strong was one word for it. Sacred might have been closer, but Elias had not used words like that in many years. He bandaged the shoulder as best he could, wrapped it tight, and pressed his forehead briefly to Ghost's. The dog breathed into his beard, warm and alive. For one dangerous second, memory overlapped the moment. Caleb at 16, bruised after a wrestling match, letting Elias tape his knuckles in the garage because it was one of the few times the boy got touch from his father that didn't feel accidental. Caleb saying, "You always know what to do when something's broken, Dad. Except when it's a person." Elias had laughed then, because laughter was easier than hearing the plea inside the joke. Now, kneeling in a valve room under Black Anvil Mountain with a bleeding dog and his dead father's letter against his chest, he understood that half his life had been spent treating the wrong wounds. A pounding came at the barred door. Pike, maybe, or the others regrouping. Henry Voss's voice continued drifting through the old speaker system, distorted by age but unmistakably composed. "Sublevel purge in 10 minutes. This is your final courtesy." Elias stood and studied the valve diagrams bolted to the wall. One line ran to reactor cooling. Another to exhaust shaft manual. Another, more interesting, to emergency comms power isolate. If he could bring backup current to the communications rack upstairs or some auxiliary antenna below, maybe he could get Daniel's tapes out before Voss buried them. But the map also showed a more immediate truth: the purge Voss threatened was real. Floodgates existed, probably intended for fire suppression or contamination isolation. If opened, Sublevel C would become an ice-cold grave. He pulled Daniel's letter free at last and read it by Mara's light, while the doors shook under renewed impacts. The handwriting grew less steady toward the end. "Son, I have done many things wrong, but leaving you was not one of them. If there is a man in you who wants to run from pain by freezing it, fight him. That kind of ice never protects anyone. If a good creature chooses your side in this world, honor that. They know what men forget." Elias read the lines twice, then folded the page with the care of a man handling a relic and tucked it back inside his coat. There was a smaller note behind it he had missed, slipped into the crease. "Wade knows more than he admits. He was a boy then. He saw me taken below. That changed the equation." Sheriff Wade Mallory had not merely inherited a family lie. He had seen some part of the original sin with his own eyes. Before Elias could speak the thought aloud, a new voice sounded from the corridor beyond the pounding, older and hoarse and carrying the weight of a life spent bargaining with cowardice. "Back away from that damn door." Silence followed, tense and brief. Then a gunshot. A body fell. Mara flinched. "Dad?" The pounding stopped. There came the scrape of something heavy being dragged, then Wade Mallory's strained voice through the steel. "Open up before I lose my nerve again." Elias pulled the wrench free, weapon raised. Wade stumbled in with snow still clinging to the shoulders of his sheriff's coat and blood on his cheek that wasn't all his. He looked 20 years older than he had at the shelter door. In one hand he held a revolver. In the other, a flashlight shaking hard enough to betray every ounce of guilt beneath it. His eyes found Mara first, then Ghost, then Elias. Shane crossed his face like weather. "Henry sealed the upper hatch after the rig team came through," he said. "Says he's protecting county assets. Pike's gone rabid. 2 of Voss's hired boys are dead and the rest won't stop till they get those files." Mara stared at him as if deciding whether father was still a word she could use. "You locked us out," she said. Wade closed his eyes briefly. "I know." Elias did not lower his pistol. "My father," he said. "You saw what happened?" Wade looked at the floor. "I was 12. My old man brought me supplies during the storm. August Voss told everybody the annex was relief storage. I heard yelling. Saw Daniel Thorne with a dog beside him and a little boy clinging to his leg down in the lower corridor. Daniel told me to remember his name. Voss hit him with a flashlight and my father dragged me out. Next day they said there'd been an avalanche and no survivors from some road accident. Then they said Daniel had vanished. My father told me if I spoke, Mercy Pass would be done. Jobs, water contracts, federal money, everything. I've been carrying that rot ever since. The confession landed in the valve room like another collapse. Elias wanted to hate the man cleanly. But age had taught him that cowardice and remorse often shared the same face for too long to separate. Wade took a step forward. There's an old emergency comm station off reactor control. Still had reserve batteries last I knew from the maintenance plans Henry dug up. If you get those recordings on open county frequency, every radio in town and every state plow on the highway will hear it. Henry can't smother that. And Henry? Elias asked. Wade's jaw tightened. He's headed to Omega Vault himself. Whatever's in there matters more to him than killing you. Another heavy boom rolled through the annex. This one deeper, more mechanical. The floor shivered. Mara gripped the pipe behind her. Wade looked up at the gauges on the wall. Needles that had sat near dead stop for half a century were climbing now, slow but undeniable, trembling toward pressure zones marked in old red paint, and the look on Wade Mallory's face told Elias the old sheriff understood exactly what that meant. Henry hadn't just sent men below to erase evidence. He had started machinery he barely understood in a facility built by men who believed secrecy was sturdier than concrete. The purge won't just flood this level, Wade said, voice thick with smoke, shame, and urgency. The lower drains feed the old runoff channel. If he forces coolant water through the emergency wash line, it goes straight under the ridge and into North Creek by Thal. Mercy Pass drinks from that basin. Mara stared at her father, as if she had run out of ways to be disappointed. So he's willing to poison the whole valley to keep his family name clean. Wade didn't defend Henry, didn't defend himself, didn't even try. Men like Henry never think in poison. They think in acceptable losses. Elias looked at Ghost, saw the dog brace despite the bandage darkening at the shoulder, and felt something hard and clear settle into place inside him. For years he had lived as if survival were the best a man could hope for after enough grief. But survival was not what stood before him now. What stood before him was a choice between finally becoming the man his father had asked him to be or remaining the hollowed veteran the world had found so easy to cast aside. Then we stop the purge, get the archive, and put Henry on every radio from here to the state line, he said. Ghost rose before anyone else moved, ears forward, as if the dog had been waiting for the man to remember how to sound like himself. They left the valve room and pushed deeper into the lower annex, Wade now leading them through a route he knew only from childhood memory and years of pretending he had forgotten. The corridor narrowed, bent twice, and opened into an old decontamination gallery lined with yellowing shower nozzles and rubber curtains stiff as bark. Radiation placards glowed faintly where Mara's flashlight passed over them. Beyond that lay the heart of the place, and the architecture changed once more from bunker to burial chamber. The walls of the Omega sector were poured thicker, reinforced by steel ribs. Observation windows were not meant for comfort here but for witnessing from safety what others endured beyond glass. One room held the auxiliary core itself, or what remained of it, a squat cylindrical unit behind cracked leaded panes, cables snaking away like dead roots, frost blooming around its base where decades of cold had preserved the last breath of a government experiment no one would ever admit existed. Another room held shelves of black cases stamped with hazard labels and dates from 1967, 1968, 1969, years that made no sense until Elias remembered what governments do when a program fails in public but survives in private. They rename it, relocate it, deny it, bury it, and call the burial national security. Ghost stopped at a cross corridor and growled low. Elias killed his light. A second later, boots scraped on metal grating ahead and a voice hissed. They're down here somewhere. Voss wants the tapes first. Bodies later. Pike. Alive, furious, and stupid enough to still think anger was strategy. Wade touched Elias's arm and pointed upward toward an overhead maintenance crawl barely wide enough for a man. Ghost saw it too and jumped, paws landing on a lower pipe brace, then another, then vanishing into the darkness of the chase with a grace that made him seem less dog than storm-born thing. Elias boosted Mara up, then passed the reels and Daniel's letter, then hauled himself after her while Wade climbed last with a grunt that told the truth about his age. Beneath them Pike and 2 Voss men passed so close Elias could smell gun oil and wet wool. One paused beneath the crawl and looked back, suspicious, but before he could raise his light, Ghost moved above them with deliberate force. Rust flakes and a loose bolt rattled down the far side of the corridor. The men pivoted toward the noise and ran after it, chasing the ghost of a ghost while the real one waited perfectly still in the dark above. They crawled the chase for 20 suffocating yards, elbows grinding through dust, old insulation sticking to their sleeves, until the shaft opened onto a grated overlook above the Omega control room. From there Elias finally saw Henry Voss in full. He stood below in a black storm coat beside a bank of portable power units and modern drill cases, looking less like an executive now than the final heir to a family trade built on clean hands and dirty ground. He was not alone. 2 remaining mercenaries covered the doors. On the control desk before Henry lay open files, film reels, a county plat map, and something smaller that made Elias's blood go still when he recognized it, Daniel Thorne's old wallet photo, the same image he had found in the jacket pocket, meaning Henry had known exactly whose history he was erasing. Henry lifted a handset connected to the annex PA and said in the calm voice of a man still performing civility for himself, "Elias, if you can hear me, understand this has never been personal. Your father made it personal. Men who refuse scale always do. The annex was a federal arrangement. My grandfather kept this valley economically alive for 30 years after Washington washed its hands. Roads, jobs, power leases, logging access, winter relief. Do you think Mercy Pass exists because decent men told the truth at the right moment?" Elias almost answered, but Mara gripped his sleeve. Below them Henry continued, "What happened in 1968 was regrettable, but scandal would have killed this town. It still would. People don't survive purity, Mr. Thorne. They survive management." Wade's face tightened in the dim. He had lived an entire life under that poisoned sentence. Then Henry picked up another file and tapped it against the desk. "I have burial logs, transfer authorizations, Signal Corps correspondence, witness names, and contamination tables. Enough filth to drown every family in this county under lawsuits, state seizure, federal quarantine, and national attention they will never recover from. Or I'd burn it all tonight and Mercy Pass remains what it has always been, a hard place that endured." That was when Ghost made the choice for all of them. The white shepherd slipped through the broken upper grate, dropped 12 feet onto a cable rack, then sprang to the control room floor in a blur of pale muscle and silent violence. One mercenary barely had time to shout before Ghost hit him at the knees and drove him backward into the battery stack. Lights burst in sparks. The second man swung his rifle too slow. Elias was already dropping from the overlook. He landed hard, shoulder exploding with old pain, rolled, fired once, and the rifle spun away across the concrete. Mara came down behind him with Wade, who shouted Henry's name with the strange cracked fury of a man finally sick of kneeling. For 3 seconds the room became pure collision, boots, metal, sparks, gunshots, Ghost snarling impact, Mara kicking a weapon under the desk, Wade firing over old reflex and older regret. Then Pike appeared from the rear service door, blood-soaked forearm wrapped in a rag, revolver shaking in his grip, and put the barrel against Mara's head. Everything stopped. Even Ghost froze, chest heaving, muzzle dark with grease and blood. Pike's eyes were wild now, no longer loyal to anyone but fear. "Back off," he rasped. "All of you. Mr. Voss walks or she dies." Henry didn't look at Mara. He looked at the reels in Elias's coat and gave the smallest tired smile. "This is what comes of letting lesser men improvise," he said, and in that moment Elias understood something Pike never would. Henry Voss had already decided the deputy was disposable too. The old soldier shifted his weight half an inch, felt Ghost notice, felt the room gather around the possibility of movement, and knew the next breath would decide which ghosts finally left the mountain and which stayed buried forever. Henry Voss had spent his life learning how to make evil sound administrative, but Pike's revolver against Mara's temple tore away the language and left only the naked machinery beneath. The deputy's hand shook, breath sawing in and out, blood running through the bandage Ghost had given him, and Elias saw what men like Henry always miss about the desperate tools they pick up: fear does not stay owned. It mutates. It turns. It begins wanting witnesses dead not for strategy but because terror cannot tolerate eyes. "Let her go," Wade said, and for the first time since Elias had known him the sheriff sounded like a father before he sounded like a coward. Pike dragged Mara tighter against him and laughed once, sharp and broken. "You first, Sheriff. You picked the wrong side too late." Henry glanced toward the pressure gauges, saw how close the purge cycle was to automatic release, and made his calculation. "Owen," he said with cold patience, "shoot Mr. Thorne's dog, take the reels, and then do whatever fantasy of escape is keeping you upright." The betrayal landed visibly. Pike's face faltered, just for a second, long enough for Mara to feel it. She stamped backward on his instep, threw her head into his nose, and dropped as the revolver fired. The shot took a bank of old instruments in a spray of glass. Ghost launched at the exact same instant. He did not go for the gun arm this time. He drove into Pike's chest like a white avalanche, slamming both of them into the control desk hard enough to scatter files and reels across the floor. Elias fired at the ceiling light above Henry, plunging half the room into strobing dimness from the failing battery packs, then closed the distance. Henry grabbed for a flare pistol lying near the map table and turned with more speed than Elias expected from a man who lived indoors and killed by signature. The flare erupted between them in a savage bloom of white fire. Elias twisted aside, but not cleanly enough. Burning magnesium clipped his coat and seared across his ribs like a branding iron. He hit Henry anyway, both men crashing through a rack of folders into the side wall beneath a yellowed sign that read Omega Archive. Somewhere to the right, Wade wrestled Pike's revolver away while Mara crawled for the filmed canisters. Ghost, favoring the wounded shoulder yet moving on sheer loyalty and trained ferocity, stood over the fallen deputy with teeth bared and eyes lit from within by the sputtering emergency lights. Henry fought filthy. Elias respected that in enemies and despised it in civilians. Knee to the spine, thumb for the eye, elbow to old scar tissue. The man knew where to hurt because privilege studies weakness the way soldiers study terrain. But Elias had been broken by professionals in harsher places, and grief had made him durable in ways Henry couldn't read. He drove the heel of his hand into Henry's throat, pinned him against the archive cage, and snarled. "What was down here?" Henry coughed, smiled through it, and whispered, "Your father died for a Russian and 2 witnesses nobody would remember." Elias slammed his head against the mesh hard enough to ring steel. "Say it straight." Henry's laugh came wet now. "Project Winter Lantern. Portable reactor, field deployment, treaty deniable. My grandfather hosted storage and testing because the county needed federal money. Then a Soviet engineer defected with failure data and contamination projections. Kozlov. The government wanted what he knew before Moscow did. His wife and son were being moved under unofficial cover when the storm wrecked the transfer truck on the pass. They got brought in here by accident. Your father heard too much. So did the dog. Mara had found a projector case among Voss's equipment, and was feeding one of the recovered reels through it with trembling hands. Wade moved to help her, then stopped, staring at Henry as if a man could still be shocked by the full dimensions of rot after a lifetime inhaling it. "You buried a child," he said. Henry looked at him with contempt so complete it was almost boredom. "We buried a risk. That is what your father understood. That is what you almost understood. Small places do not survive moral theater." The projector caught. Film fluttered through the gate, throwing shivering black and white light across the control room wall. The image was grainy, handheld, probably shot by Daniel or another technician in secret, but it was enough. A corridor appeared. Daniel's voice off camera. A woman with dark hair clutching a small boy in a wool cap, both frightened, both alive. Then another frame, a gaunt man in hospital restraints, face swollen, speaking urgently toward the lens in accented English. core fails if cooling loop compromised. They bury it, whole valley poisoned. Voss knows. Then came chaos. Men shouting. Someone grabbing for the camera. August Voss stepping into frame, not in rumor now but in proof, sharp-featured and immaculate in a suit under a military overcoat, ordering. Seal lower medical and remove the bodies from manifest. The film bucked. For one terrible instant Daniel turned the camera toward himself, eyes exhausted and frightened and unmistakably Elias's own. "If this gets out," he said into the lens, "my son will know I stayed." The room went silent except for the projector rattle and the far-off mechanical groan of the rising purge. Even Henry Voss lost something in his face then, not remorse but the last comfortable fiction that history belonged to whoever controlled the paperwork. Wade's shoulders sagged as though the weight of his father, his badge, his whole compromised life had finally chosen to sit where it belonged. Mara looked at Elias with tears standing in her eyes, not pity, not sympathy, but recognition so clean it hurt. Ghost turned from Pike and came to Elias's side, pressing against his leg as the image of Daniel trembled across steel and concrete. The son stared at the father he had spent a lifetime condemning in absence, and found not abandonment but courage, flawed and frightened and doomed, yet still courage. Henry saw the shift and lunged for the purge lever. Wade shot him through the side before Elias could move. The round spun Henry into the control desk. Blood darkened his coat, but his hand still caught the lever on the way down and dragged it half open. Sirens exploded to life all at once. Red lights began turning in the corridor outside. On the gauges the needles slammed upward. "Manual override!" Wade shouted, pale now, one hand pressed to his own abdomen where Pike had shot him in the struggle and nobody had noticed until the blood started falling. "Has to be done at the exhaust wheel. In the shaft chamber. If purge opens fully, runoff goes through the whole lower system." Mara moved toward him, but he shook his head. "No. Listen to me for once. Get the tapes to comms. Broadcast everything. State police, emergency bands, all of it. Henry doesn't die winning." Elias looked from the reels to the red lights to Wade bleeding onto the floor. "You won't make the shaft alone." Wade gave a broken little smile. "That's why I'm asking for the dog." Mara's face crumpled. "Dad, he's smarter than I am," Wade said, and Ghost, as if understanding far more than any human sentence deserved, looked from Wade to Elias and waited. That was the cruelty of deep trust. Elias could send men into fire. He had done it. But sending Ghost into danger felt like placing the last clean part of his own soul in harm's way. Wade met his eyes. "I owe your family more than an apology." The siren deepened. Somewhere below, heavy gates began to move. Elias crouched, gripped Ghost's ruff in both hands, and pressed his brow to the dog's. "Go with him," he whispered. "Then come back to me." Ghost held the gaze 1 second longer than seemed possible, then turned and took position at Wade's side. Wade touched Mara's cheek with a blood-wet hand, looked once at Elias as if asking a dead man for permission to try becoming better too late, and then he and the white shepherd disappeared into the red-lit corridor toward the shaft chamber while Elias and Mara ran for the communications room with Daniel's truth under their arms and the mountain beginning to shake itself awake around them. They ran through a bunker no longer pretending to be dead. Red emergency strobes spun through the corridors, painting the concrete in pulses of wound-like light. Somewhere behind them steam began venting through ancient pipes with the shriek of metal remembering pressure. Somewhere ahead automatic bulkheads were trying to cycle on power never meant to wake again. Mara carried the film reels against her chest like rescued children. Elias carried Daniel's letter inside his coat over a heart that felt too full and too broken to keep working. Every few strides he looked back for the flash of white fur that did not appear. That absence hurt more than the burn in his ribs, more than the ache in his shoulder, more than the fact that he might be racing toward daylight without the one companion who had made daylight bearable. The emergency comm station sat off the upper utility spine exactly where Wade had said, sealed behind a warped door marked County Civil Defense Relay. Elias shot the lock, kicked it in, and found a room half buried in dust and old cigarette smell. A rack transmitter stood against one wall beside a spool antenna feed, and a county frequency board yellowed with age. More importantly, someone from Voss's team had already wired portable batteries into the backup bus but hadn't finished the job. Mara dropped to one knee at the console, hands moving with the blunt practical speed of a medic who understood equipment under stress. "I can get power to the broadcast circuit if the mast line's intact." Elias fed Daniel's audio reel into the station deck and prayed to a god he had mostly ignored since Caleb's funeral. Outside, a deep metallic concussion rolled through the annex. Dust fell from the ceiling tiles. The deck whined, caught, and Daniel Thorne's voice filled the room, first through the tiny local speaker, then through the transmitter as Mara slammed the main send toggle forward. Every open county radio, every sheriff car, every snowplow, every state maintenance rig on emergency scan, every storm-bound trucker sitting on Highway 12 under a curtain of ice and fear heard the dead man speak out of the mountain. "Daniel Thorne, technician, Sentinel Ridge Annex. February 14, 1968. If this recording survives..." Elias switched feeds and pushed the projector film audio line through a microphone, while Mara opened the general hail channel. "This is Mercy Pass emergency traffic," she said, voice shaking only once. "This is Mara Mallory, county paramedic. Sheriff Wade Mallory and Elias Thorne have uncovered evidence of a historical federal containment cover-up under Black Enville Mountain involving Henry Voss and an active contamination threat. Repeat, active contamination threat. Lock down North Creek intake immediately and dispatch state authorities to Sentinel Ridge access." She looked at Elias. "Again?" He nodded. She repeated it louder. Then they sent the film's spoken section, August Voss's order to remove bodies from manifest, Kozlov's warning, Daniel's last words. Truth left the bunker not as rumor or accusation but as voice, image, name, and fear. No one would ever stuff it back into a file drawer again. A crackle answered on the return band. Then several. County plows. State Patrol. A lineman truck trapped near the West Fork. Someone at the church shelter screaming, "Wade, answer me!" Another voice, unmistakably from Mercy Pass itself, old Mrs. Barlow, who had lived there since before Elias enlisted, whispering over open radio like prayer. "Daniel stayed?" Elias closed his eyes for 1 second and let that land. The mountain answered with a roar. The floor lurched. Alarms changed pitch. Mara grabbed the gauge board by the doorway and blanched. The purge line's still opening. That meant Wade hadn't reached the wheel or hadn't reached it in time. Elias turned and ran before thought could interfere. He found the shaft chamber by sound first, then by steam. The corridor leading to it had partially collapsed, concrete chunks and twisted conduit turning the space into a throat of rubble and scalding mist. Beyond the haze he saw Wade Mallory on the catwalk above the exhaust wheel, hanging by one arm over a drop that vanished into hissing dark. Blood covered his coat. The wheel had been turned part way, enough to stall the purge but not enough to lock it out. Below him, braced against the lower guardrail, straining every ounce of his body upward by the leash wrapped in his jaws, was Ghost. The white shepherd's bandaged shoulder had burst open again, red running through fur and down his foreleg, but he held fast, paws skidding on wet steel, literally keeping the sheriff from falling into the shaft. Elias scrambled onto the catwalk, hooked his good arm around Wade's wrist, and hauled with everything left in him. Mara appeared behind, grabbing Wade's belt. Together they dragged the old sheriff over the rail. The moment his weight came free, Ghost staggered, nearly slipped, and Elias dropped to his knees to catch him. For 1 suspended second man and dog simply held each other on the vibrating steel, while steam screamed all around them. Wade coughed blood and pointed weakly at the wheel. "Lock it!" One more turn. Elias gave Ghost to Mara, seized the wheel, and heaved. Old gears fought, then yielded with a thunderous clunk that echoed down the shaft. Somewhere deep in the annex, enormous valves slammed shut. The siren died mid-wail. Pressure on the gauge nearest the door began to fall. No purge. No poisoned runoff. No burial by flood. Henry Voss had lost the mountain. But the mountain, cheated of one ending, reached for another. A support beam snapped somewhere overhead with the gunshot crack of structural failure. The catwalk lurched. Concrete rained down. "Move!" Elias shouted. They half-carried, half-dragged Wade back through the rubble while the annex collapsed in sections behind them, history finally refusing containment. Every corridor they had crossed on the way and now felt narrower, lower, doomed. Emergency lights died one string at a time, leaving long swaths of darkness broken only by Mara's failing beam and the pale moving shape of Ghost beside Elias's leg. Twice the dog stumbled. Twice Elias nearly stopped altogether, terror rising so violently he could barely see. "Stay with me," he kept saying, to Ghost, to Wade, to the dead, to himself. "Stay with me." They reached the main access ladder just as dawn-colored light began leaking around the hatch seam above. State rescue teams had found the upper entrance, probably guided by the broadcast, probably cutting through snow and twisted rig equipment, while the whole ridge still howled under the blizzard's last anger. Voices shouted overhead. Hands reached down. Mara went first with the reels and Daniel's letter. Wade refused until Ghost was secured. Elias lifted the shepherd, every muscle in his back screaming, and passed him upward into waiting arms with a tenderness he had denied almost everything else in his life. Then he climbed with Wade on his shoulder and broke into daylight so bright and savage it looked unreal after the bunker dark. Snow still fell, but lighter now, almost gentle. Emergency vehicles lined the ridge road. State police pinned Henry Voss on a stretcher under guard, pale and snarling through an oxygen mask while cameras from regional crews arrived behind the plows. Mercy Pass had woken to the sound of its own buried shame over every radio in town. There would be no managing that. No smiling it away. No quiet deed transfer after spring thaw. Wade Mallory survived long enough to hear Mara call him Dad without bitterness for the first time in years. He squeezed her hand, looked at Elias through the ambulance doors, and said, "He stayed," meaning Daniel, meaning Ghost, meaning maybe himself at the very end, then let exhaustion take him toward whatever mercy remained for men who repent late, but honestly. Ghost was rushed to a veterinary trauma unit 2 counties over. The hours that followed were the longest Elias had faced sober. Reporters wanted quotes. Troopers wanted statements. State environmental teams wanted maps. Federal men arrived with briefcases and faces drained of color by old seals breaking in public. Elias gave them all what they needed because for the first time in a long time his silence no longer felt like strength. But none of it mattered until the surgeon came out in green scrubs with dried blood at the cuff and said, "He's going to make it. Toughest dog I've ever seen." Elias sat down right there against the corridor wall because his legs had forgotten how to hold relief. He laughed once, then covered his eyes with both hands and let the sound become whatever it needed to become. Spring came late to Mercy Pass that year. North Creek was closed and tested. The annex was excavated under state and federal order. Daniel Thorne's remains were found in a sealed lower chamber beside the remains of Elena Kozlov and her son, and beside the skeleton of a working dog whose collar identified him as Harker. They were not left in the dark again. Henry Voss was charged under a pile of state and federal counts so heavy even his family name could not lift them. Old land records surfaced. Compensation boards formed. The town learned that survival purchased with lies is just a slower kind of ruin. And on a clear morning in June, beneath a sky finally emptied of storm, Mercy Pass gathered on the ridge above Black Anvil Mountain where the snow had once tried to swallow one man and the dog who refused to leave him. They set 4 markers there at first, then a 5th when Mara insisted the memorial needed to say what everyone now knew, that truth sometimes returns because the loyal refuse to step over what the powerful bury. Elias stood in dress blues he had not worn since Caleb's burial, the cloth tighter now, the metals heavier with memory than pride. Beside him sat Ghost, shoulders shaved where the scar healed pink beneath returning white fur, eyes fixed not on the crowd but on Elias, always on Elias. When the time came to speak, the old seal looked down at the names cut into stone and did not try to sound heroic. "I spent most of my life believing I came from a man who ran," he said. Then I spent more years becoming one in quieter ways. Running from grief. From love. From the people who needed me to feel something besides duty. My father stayed. This dog stayed. The town has a chance now to stay with the truth, even if it hurts. Wind moved softly through the pines. Someone cried openly. No one seemed ashamed of it. Afterward, when the crowd thinned and the mountain settled into evening gold, Elias remained by the markers with Ghost and Mara. Down below, Mercy Pass looked smaller than it had in winter, but cleaner somehow, as if confession had altered the light. Ghost leaned against Elias's leg with the full unembarrassed weight of trust. Elias rested a hand on the shepherd's neck and felt the steady pulse there, the simple living proof that loyalty had led him not just into danger, but back out of burial. He thought of Caleb, of Anna, of Daniel, of all the men who had mistaken hardness for endurance and silence for control. Then he looked at Ghost and finally understood the line from the letter his father had written under a mountain that expected him to disappear. If a good creature chooses your side in this world, honor that. They know what men forget. So Elias did. He turned toward home, not the cabin burned down to black ribs, not the old lies of Mercy Pass, but the hard new thing that could still be built from truth, service, grief, and the white shepherd who had dug through a blizzard and found the buried heart of a family. And as the last light touched the ridge where the dead were finally named, the veteran and the dog walked on together, no longer cast out, no longer lost, carrying into the quiet a kind of redemption that did not erase pain, but taught it, at last, to stop ruling everything.